All this was not sufficient to give my husband peace of mind. He could not sleep. Nor would let me sleep, still ruminating on his house being brought to ruin by the malice and power of his unjust adversary. I bid my husband fear that great being that sets out a tyrant's limitation, and disables him from exceeding his boundary. The infamy was hard to bear, but would not the guilt have been much harder? Therefore give God the praise of an honest heart, which your antagonist wants. Although you have your foibles, you might be more diligent, careful, and affectionate in your family. But that is to me, not to the world, which I dare say you never did wrong to. As to this great man, I will write him a letter in the morning, and show him how much I love or fear him, nor will I tamely let him rob me of my character, nor will be willing to let my children be branded with their father's stealing this tyrant's wine. By 3 in the morning I arose, and writ him a letter. The contents of it were, how much the warm reception had terrified my husband, but how little it had frightened me, who gave him the consolation of his worship's committing the same mistake on a far greater man, whose light so shines that thousands seeth his good works and praises them, whose lady never joined in concert against a person in distress, adding that if this all-worthy man met with the same fate from his worship, what reason my husband had to be content with his, and if he solicits his judge, he will relieve his wrongs at his time and pleasure. This was the consolation given her husband, from yours, A.C. About half an hour after he had received this letter, a neighbor came, and with great concern told me how much it grieved the neighborhood in general to hear this hero declare aloud in the open street that he could freely forgive my husband, but swore to be the destruction of the bitch, his wife. In which answered I, he fulfills that portion of Scripture, a good tree cannot bring forth bad fruit, neither can a corrupt tree bring forth good fruit. Hence the tree is known by its fruit, for it is not the advantage of a liberal education, nor the improvements of 4 years' travel in France and Rome, neither the benefits that he received from the touch, nor the great rise to a plentiful fortune, that can make a corrupt tree bring forth good fruit. Cannot any ass bray in the streets? Nay, an idiot can shout out, bitch. Great was his industry in showing this infamous letter to gentlemen, but not meeting with his desired success, put him to the torture that tyrants without power feeleth. We having most of the council that rode the circuit with the judges, my husband went to Newcastle every year to receive their orders, and notwithstanding this infamous letter, was resolved to go according to his custom. But his antagonist, although a gentleman of fortune, with his lady and equipage, came but to his house the evening before from Northamptonshire. Yet these grand visitors could not soothe the venom of this savage breast, for he left his strangers to pursue his revenge, and did complete his work. When my husband spoke to the Chancellor, he was answered with rogue and villain. Sir, said my husband, I am neither, nor can I think my antagonist will, in cool blood, asperse me. Thou liest, answered the Chancellor, for I have been with this gentleman this instant, who hath convinced me of thy vility. Neither shall a lawyer come to thy house, nor judge, if I can keep them from it. Yet for all these threatenings, my husband, conscious of his innocence, which he resolved to plead to the council, in hopes to find more candour for them. But rogue, villain, and beggar were all their answers. Notwithstanding this general reproach, his guiltless soul prompted him to see the extent of this malice. Accordingly, he went to know the judge's will and pleasure, and asking the man that calls the trials whether his lords would be at his house or not. The man answered, Did they lodge at thy house last year? My husband answered, They did. Then said he, I have heard of thy fame, and we will all surely be at thy house. But as no doubt thou hast some business to transact, come to the court after. Then will I speak to my lord, and there thou shalt receive thy orders. My husband accordingly went to the court, and one of the bailiffs told the crier that the landlord waited his answer. Let him stand up on high by me, answered the crier, that all the court may see him and hear his answer, which may add to the credit of his house. My husband said, I rather choose to stand where I am. Then did the crier knock my husband, and with a loud voice said, How durst thou, that is a rogue, presume to ask the judges to come to thy house? Dost thou not know that they come to hang rogues, and not to encourage them? Behold the impudence of this landlord, that after he robbed the council of their wine, dare presume to ask the judges to lodge in thy house. But 4 principal inhabitants being in the court, in a whisper said, Behold the extent of inveterate malice. Let us rebuke that fellow, and do our neighbor justice. A worthy gentleman of integrity and honor stood up, and said unto him, You are taking a liberty with that man that very ill becomes you. For we have heard that story before now, and believes him to be an honest man. Another said, We that are his neighbors must know him better than thou that is a stranger. A third said, He keeps the best house of entertainment and custom in the place, which put this fellow to silence. This was 2 assizes, and at the third there was debates between the chancellor and lawyer Askew, who said he blamed Cook at the first hearing, but his accuser at the second. He came to the house and told us that our great adversary had not succeeded in his undertaking against us. This hero, still eager of revenge, got to be a commissioner of the land tax, and got some of his allies in at the same time, I having all except 2 of the old commissioners and the clerk, that were all very worthy guests to my house, and some of them much more powerful than himself. Although this hero was the youngest in the commission, yet in expectation of having that respect paid him that was paid, a chairman told the bench that he had ordered a dinner at an inn, where he hoped they all would dine with him. But Mr. Reed of Chipchase answered that it was a compliment paid the judge at the general sessions, but as the majority of the commissioners of the land tax was guests to Cook, he had ordered dinner there. This, no doubt, was a hard pill for this hero to digest. In 14 days the commissioners had another meeting, and one of them came to me and said that the chairman had made such proposals as the ties of Christians obliged them to comply with, for, added he, this was his speech. Gentlemen, as the rectifying the land tax on the lands of Roman Catholics requires our frequent meetings, it must be very reasonable for us all dining together, as we may transact business at that time, in the house where we dine. And is it not very hard for all to go to one house? And I hope this worthy assembly will oblige me in this proposal of good neighborhood and Christian charity. But, added the commissioner, I answered that we had bespoke dinner at your house this day, and if he would dine with us, I would, if all the rest of your guests joined with me, oblige him in this proposal. But what think you of it? I answered that my antagonist was seeming kind to his neighbors, but would it not be more generous were it at his own expense? For at that rate he would but give me the 5th part of my trade, and at the same time sets himself out for the good neighbor, although it seems as just for me to say, why should he have so much land and I none? Or, should not there be a distribution of all lands, and give each an equal share? He said that I was certainly right. Yet as they had promised him, they all resolved to be the same friends to our house, as they were very certain they could not meet with better entertainment, and I will let him know this, if he dines with us this day, according to his promise. But he did not dine with them, nor sent any apology for the breach of his promise. Yet they all went with this hero to dine as they had promised him, and their charges were 3 half-crowns each. This gentleman, addressing himself to the chairman, said, "Sir, we have performed our promise in attending you, as you proposed the last meeting, wherein you alleged that it was hard for all to go to one house. But here I plainly see double the number of company that was at our house, as every house hath its separate custom. And it appears to me that you would by stratagem take all the custom from our house, although you promised to dine with us. You did not. So I hope you will not expect us being any longer at your call, for in obliging you we must hurt your neighbor." "Sir," answered I, "my creditors and numerous family of children requires the full extent of my trade, which, contrary to the laws of God and man, this tyrant has made it his business to obstruct. Now I begin to pity his poor ignoble soul, and wants to be free of his malice. If I can meet with a convenient house out of his jurisdiction, where I can receive the profit of my diligence and pains, and have a prospect to live in peace, I would freely leave him the field." Two of the neighboring landlords, making a great complaint of the decay of trade, besides, added they, "We have not had horse races these 4 years, nor will the great squire let a race be as long as you are in the town." I answered, "You two are both his cousins by your wives, and if you can act the part of 2 politicians, I can put you into the way to trick horse races out of him." They promised me they would. "Then," answered I, "go both of you to your great cousin, and soothe his vainglory with reverend bows, and tell him how much you are piqued that my husband hath had 16 pounds of the booking money of the last races 4 years, and braves you by saying that he never will pay it up till you bring him a list, signed with the squire's name for another race. Then you shall receive the money, and not before." Accordingly they went, were received with a hearty welcome, and bid them come in the evening, and should have their requests fulfilled. "But," added he, "my steward shall receive the money." "Very well," said I, "leave that part for me to act. But first I'll lend you the parchment that they subscribed their names in." "But," answered they, "take care not to raise his spleen against us." "Leave that to me also." In the evening comes the 2 landlords, and their great cousin's steward, who said that he came to receive the booking money that we had, which was to help up the races. "What races?" said I. One of the landlords answered, "Your husband said that at the receipt of these gentlemen's names to another race, he would pay up that money." "But where is their names?" said I. So he gave me the list. I read it and said, "Is not this the very parchment that I bought last year, and you were refused signing it?" "We know the parchment to be yours, but you have no right to these gentlemen's names." "I will dispute that right with you or your Grand Master," said I, turning to the steward. "These 2 fellows have been with your heroic master, scheming and contriving to get this booking money into thy master's coffer, or strong box, as we call it. But ask him what right he hath to make this demand." These fellows had only my husband's promise for the money, which promise they resigned to thy master. But I don't think that it would be doing the sportsman justice to give this money out of my husband's hand, for besides we shall make great advantage in trading with it, so that putting it into your master's strong box, where there is no need of it, is burying this talent in the earth. Therefore tell your master that I treat for peace with him, as well for his own sake as mine, that he may enjoy his plentiful fortune with pleasure, and that I may reap the profit of my lawful industry, without his interruption. But instead of this hero adhering to my treaty of peace, open war was declared against me. Nor should there be any races. Yet as we had his name subscribed, the gentlemen seemed all well pleased with the stratagem, and with pleasure subscribed to the races. The ladies told me that if I could get a room fit for an assembly, they would come and make up the loss that I had sustained by my envious enemy. I, having a worthy landlord, told him the lady's request, who, with great pleasure was at the charge of pulling down a partition, which made a room 13 yards long, having 5 sash windows, made it a commodious assembly room, painted all the doors and windows, and the balusters of the stairs, during which time my antagonist was taking great pains to disannul the races, told the gentleman that it was so late on the year, by the indolence of those fellows, that there could be no races. But the gentleman said that it would be a very good time for them, besides they were all desirous of some sport, it being so long since they had any, and added Mrs. Cook hath got a long room for an assembly, so that we shall get a dance. But Sir John Cope's army and the Highlanders being very near each other in Scotland, gave great confusion, and a great meeting of gentlemen being called together at Morpeth, this hero stood up and told the audience that the people in Hexham, contrary to his inclination, would have horse races, which might give a great many Papists and Jacobites an opportunity of meeting, who might conspire together at this critical juncture. He therefore thought it requisite and necessary to have the bench to make an order to forbid these races, for the nation's safety. A noble baronet answered, Sir, races in such little towns are made for the benefit of low-life people. Instead of suppressing them, let us all unanimously meet, and spend some money to help them to live. But this did not answer the hero's end, for whether he got an order signed by the bench of justices or not, he came home, sent for the 2 landlords and my husband, and said to them, You all know the confusion the nation is in, with the rebels in Scotland, and their defeat over the king's army, which put the whole nation into such a ferment, as the bench thought proper to make an order to forbid races, and to deem them rebels that presumed to let a race be on Tyne Green. To which my husband answered that these races were advertised by the royal order. The horses were all booked according to that advertisement, and if his worship would satisfy these men, he was willing, but not otherwise. He bid him send them to him, which my husband did, and they returned with an order from this hero to my husband, to return the jockeys their booking money, and to pay each man 2 guineas. He told them their booking money they should have, but must get their charges from this hero. They went and told him their answer, who then sent an attorney to my husband to tell him that if he would not pay the jockeys that money, he would commit him to jail. He answered that he was willing to go there by his mittimus, but tell him he shall either pay the jockeys, or there shall be races. Every man came with 2 guineas, there being 11 horses booked, and revenge cost 22 guineas, rather than we should have any advantage by these races. The landlord of the Queen's Head in Morpeth died then, so my husband went and took that house, furniture, and stock. The landlord of the house gave bond with my husband for the money, which was £369. We were obliged to keep the inn at Hexham 3 months longer, so that we had both these inns in these confusions. The king's army being at Hexham, the 2 Dutch generals were both at our house, when my daughter had it to manage, which she did to the admiration of all that saw her, for she was but 17 years of age, and dressed above 60 dishes of meat every day, for 5 days, nor did she get any rest at night, but what she got in the kitchen. My youngest daughter came to me at Morpeth, and said that she had rather die than see another camp at Hexham, although, said she, I had much the better of my sister, that never had her clothes off for 5 days. The 2 Dutch cooks made nothing for the generals but soups, and my poor sister, with the help that I could make, had all the meat to dress, and my father and her slept in the kitchen, amongst 50 military men. We were all thankful you were not there, for the severity of the weather, hurry, and confusion would have killed you. For I had not recovered of a miscarriage, which very much impaired my health, and reduced me to great weakness. Yet in this bad state of health I had more cookery to perform than I had at Hexham, for the army came all through Morpeth for Scotland. I generally had 50 soldiers billeted on my house, and had most of the officers that came from Hexham. I as frequently had 14 officers as 50 men, besides the servants, and none but my younger daughter to help me to dress all the meat for such a numerous family. But how to order so very great a family at this time, and please all parties, was the query. The long march from Hexham to Morpeth, 25 miles, in a storm, fatigued the poor soldiers greatly, and after these long marches had no beds but straw. Some lay in barns without any fire, but I resolved to make my share of them as happy as I could, for every day I boiled 2 stone of pork, 1 stone of beef, and half a peck of peas, and made 20 gallons of porridge, with plenty of barley, roots, and leeks in them. I told them that was all the attendance they would get, having so many of their officers to provide for. Nor would they get any breakfast or supper, for I would take none of their money. This was not only my duty, but my interest, for I had not the trouble of making them supper, nor breakfast, which would cost me all the money I should receive from them, exclusive of their dinners. After I had got this great hurry over, the army passed, and got my house into order, I had a visit from my landlord, who told me that a cousin of his came, and told him that he must come to her house, as there was something of importance to communicate to him. When I came there, said he, I was very much upbraided with 2 great cousins of mine, the aunt and her nephew. She told me how much I had lessened their family, in letting this house to such a rogue as you, for which offence it would be incurring their displeasure forever. I answered the landlord that I was very sorry that he should meet with any insult upon my account, but more that he should be related to these 2 troublesome adversaries of mine. For, added I have left one of the best of neighborhoods, to get rid of them, and live in tranquillity, having undergone 6 years' persecution, 3 years of which stands in record, well attested by all the council that rides the northern circuit, and most of the gentry in the country, and most of the gentry in the county. He answered that it was his belief that his cousin would in a very little time be the brightest gentleman in the county. He must improve very fast in person, mind, and fortune then, answered I, for he has at present many superiors in all these talents. When the Duke of Cumberland came through Morpeth, after the battle of Culloden, all the grand gentry in the county assembled at Morpeth, in hopes of seeing his royal highness, to congratulate him on the victory. A sumptuous entertainment was provided on that occasion, and when all souls were filled with joy, his was brimful of the old cause, so full that he burst forth to the audience and said, that cook was a rebel, a rogue, a villain. But a certain gentleman reproved him at that instant, and bid him speak with more candour, for Cook had the character of a harmless honest man, neither was he meddlesome in state affairs. I returned this gentleman my humblest thanks, and said that I had great reason to suspect him for intending to make such an information to his royal highness, that there might be an order to plunder all Jacobites. For I was privately informed that there was to be a plunder, and our house was to be the first. But as his royal highness made so short a stop, we were not molested. The next news was that he would stand candidate for Parliament man for the county. Then said I, he cannot keep the freeholders from my house. A great number of them coming one day, billets were brought to them, for such houses as were told them, but they rejected the billets. When the bills were paid, my hero's steward brought in the 22 guineas that his master paid the jockeys, but my husband produced a receipt for 8 guineas of this money, that was paid by the orders of 4 gentlemen subscribers. So my husband told the steward that he was prepared for their objection to his bill, but as he had all his separate bills attested by the freeholders, who said that if his bills were objected, they would pay him themselves. The steward, perusing these bills, said, "You may very justly demand your money, for, in my opinion, it exceeds all the parliamentarian bills for justice." The steward accordingly paid him the £50. There was a grand meeting of gentry at Morpeth races, and I had orders at 7 o'clock to provide supper for 20 ladies and gentlemen, to be ready precisely at 8. I, never having such an order before, roused up the mettle of the whole house, and had everything in order to receive this grand company, amongst whom was this hero, his lady, and aunt. This supper pleased so well that 4 noble squires bespoke a dinner for 40 ladies and gentlemen, and ordered a long table to be made, to reach from one end of the room to the other. I received this order with joy, and had the cold table finished, when I received a message that this hero had begged it as the greatest favor, that the ladies and gentlemen would dine with him at the Black Bull. However, I had as many gentlemen and servants as eat up my dinner. My eldest daughter marrying a young man who had an estate at the decease of an old aunt, there being an inn advertised to be let at Newcastle, my son went with me and took the house, which my daughter and I got very decently furnished. I did as much as I was able, and no more, and what all parents do for hopeful children, according to their abilities. This was no sooner done than a rumor arose that Cook was broke, there being a bond and judgment entered against him for £730, and that his wife had set up her daughter out of the creditor's goods. The highways were beset with people to inform travellers, and his guests were past his house. The creditors upbraided him with the injustice he had treated them with, and he pleaded his innocence. They said, "It is the same defraud if you connived with your wife. Besides, you have a judgment of £730, which is entered against you." He told them that he never was asked a judgment but by the landlord of the house, who was bound for £369, £320 of which is paid. Neither, added he, did I give him judgment, for he said he wanted no more but a letter of an attorney. The landlord's nephew came to my husband next day, and said that notwithstanding all the rumor, there was no judgment entered, and if he would sign a bond of release of heirs, it would save him £4 charge. "Villain," said my husband, "hast thou bit me once, and would bite me again," and flew into such a fury, that if the fellow had not absconded, he would have thrashed him as the villain deserved. Yet this repulse did not hinder the fellow to watch a favourable opportunity in my husband's absence, of soliciting me to persuade my husband, for the sake of my numerous family, to sign this bond of release of heirs, which will save £4 charge. I answered that I never heard of such a bond, nor did I know of a judgment. It appears to me that you durst not venture to execute it, nor enter upon the spoil, without this bond of release of heirs. "What," answered he, "do you suspect my great cousin to be at the bottom of this?" "Thou must know that best, fellow," said I. "He came to town yesterday, was invisible 2 hours, in which time it may be presumed he hath given thou thy instructions. No doubt but he has promised thou a reward, besides the plunder of our house. But if thou fail of getting this bond of release of heirs executed, his envious soul will curse thou for thy botchery, in not inserting this bond of release of heirs in the bond and judgment, which might have saved thy cousin a counsel's fee, who, no doubt, would tell him that if his attorney had known his business, he would have done it effectually at first. This being the first job of consequence that thou hast been employed in since thou got out of the Fleet prison, after thou had gotten 1,500 pounds out of the country, gave thy father a bond in judgment of 400 pounds, who entered and sold thy goods and chattels, took home thy wife, that has been a secret pawnbroker ever since. Thou did not go into Fleet prison to wait an act of grace, without provision, nor has any visible way of getting bread, has very little sense, yet with that small matter has done much harm. For thy brother-in-law, after the judge had given a charge to the jury, told them that if they found a verdict for Cook, it would bring actions against all corn sellers. This fellow, thy brother-in-law, was so industrious in telling the jury, although he was 3 times forbid the room, he gained his point. They brought a verdict for the villain that sold us a sample of good corn, and brought in the stock bad rotten corn, which we never would take possession of, and although the judge turned the jury back, they brought in the same verdict. The corn and trial cost us 70 pounds. Whether thy envious cousin was the prompter in this hellish scheme, the devil and thou knows best. For such envy, hatred, and malice renders you the seed of Beelzebub. Thou knows thyself guilty of forgery, for which a halter is thy desert. Thy cousin is a rich rogue, thou art a very poor rogue, and a great fool, almost a naked beggar, waiting on help from thy covetous uncle, who can part with nothing in his life, nor will thou get any of his riches at his death. I am an excellent fortune-teller, that will do my creditors so much justice, as to keep such a ravenous wolf as thou art from devouring what is theirs. Tell this cousin of thine that he hath made many trials, but will be victorious at last. Yet I can brave him with what very few of his kindred possesses, and that is an honest soul, a treasure that can soar above the malice of tyrants, whose judge can frustrate all treacherous designs. Away goes this miscreant, and immediately comes his wife, to know what conference I had with her husband, that had deprived him of his speech. What can be the matter? Said I. Is it a sting of conscience, or a disappointment of release of errors? At which words she burst into tears, and said, It hath been my hard fate to be matched to a man without sense or morals. This the judgment makes manifest, done to so good a friend as you have been in our distress. These tears can witness the sincerity of a grateful soul, to discharge all obligations that I stand indebted to you. Sign this bond. Aloud I laughed, and said, You are 2 creatures, that differs not in minds, but much in features. Prevaricator, up thy tears dry. That bond cannot be signed, the reason why. I must my husband's hand from paper keep, lest ye 2 laugh, while we 2 both should weep. And bid her go home to bewail the hardships of her disconsolate mourner, without sense or morals. Then did I send for the landlord, and the 2 gentlemen that were trustees to the will of the deceased landlord. They produced the bond, and received 30 pounds, which was all their demands. Then said I, Sir, this 30 pounds was all the money you could have any pretence of entering a judgment of 730 pounds, which bond you have no further pretence to keep. He delivered up this bond, as strong as my husband could be made debtor for 369 pounds, and to pay 5% interest. I read the bond to these gentlemen, and said to the landlord, Sir, if you were a Christian, you durst not have slept a night in your bed with this bond, from a man that never received your money. And had you taken a bond of indemnity of that bond, why was it not mentioned in this? Besides, you swore not to take a bond in judgment. He answered that it was as much against his inclination to do it, as to tear the flesh from his bones. But he was put upon it. I know your prompter, said I. This artifice tripped up the trade. I could not answer credit, and plainly saw the fruits of my hard labor demolish every day. And what was the greatest hardship, I, under the censure of defrauding the creditors, and the reproach of all censorious miscreants. My friends looked cold on me, so that I had only the consolation of an honest heart to console with. So that I had only the consolation of an honest heart to condole with. I pleaded with the creditors for time, and sold £200 worth of furniture, and took a house on the quayside, Newcastle. When I furnished my house, I proposed keeping a pastry-cook's shop, besides selling malt liquor, wine, and spirits, and got 2,000 gallons of malt liquor brewed. Within a month after we left Morpeth, my husband was seized for £30 by a maltster, and as I had paid up all the money to the creditors, I could not release my husband from the bailiffs. In this distress I sent for a wine merchant, to whom we owed £20, and told my hardships. But his countenance said he had rather I paid this bill, adding that he had notice given him, before we left Morpeth, that if he should give us any credit, he would never receive twopence, as there was judgment against you for £700. But, sir, answered I, did we not balance with you, since you got this notice, and paid £300, and can show you that bond of £730, with all the charges of entering this judgment, and a receipt in full of all accounts concerning this bond, from the man that took that advantage of my husband, in order to break his credit, who did not receive a farthing from him. So can I show you receipts from my creditors for £10,000 paid honestly. All the demands the world can make upon us is £380, and we have as much as may pay 10 shillings to the pound, after 10 years' persecution. The creditors had a meeting on the notice that was given from this wine merchant, but these proposals were not accepted, nor would they offer any terms but contempt. In short, I then became the scorn of wealthy fools. I could tell you such a story as would force tears from your eyes, but I rather choose to rejoice at the flowery paths you have travelled in, than see you mourn at the briars and thorns I have had to brush through, pursued by wolves and bears in human shapes. If you live to read the history of my life, in it you perhaps may see something deserving the press. For although I never was out of the counties of Durham and Northumberland but 10 days, and found 30 years so hard travelling in the latter, as may let the world see what Providence hath enabled one mortal to undergo. Who does me wrong, or hurts my reputation, if to my judge I make true application, his wisdom, goodness, supreme excellence, aids and assists in clearing innocence. A tyrant that works hard to hurt his neighbor deserves a just reward for all his labor. Finis.